those kinds of things. It's also good to see you. We're going to have a wonderful morning, and we already are having a wonderful morning. My wife has been gone for the last 5 days. She flew down to Texas to be with her sisters to attend a baby shower of her next to youngest sister, and has had a great time fellowshipping with them. She is on the way back as I speak, and I will be picking her up at the airport later this afternoon. So I have been batching it for a few days. That's why I look. Thank you. Usually she's the one that sees the little hanger things, on my shirts, and she's the one that corrects that, and if something's wrinkled and stuff. So if I don't look my normal self, that's probably why. But thank you for the compliment, Chris. I appreciate that. We are on a series on prophecy, and I'm going to be wrapping things up here hopefully in the next week or two. But if you have your Bibles, I would invite you to turn to Matthew chapter 22, and we are going to look at the parable of the wedding banquet or the wedding feast. And I think it's fitting because our church family just had a wedding yesterday, the Ritger wedding. It was held out of state, and that's why we have quite a few people gone today, including Vicki, our pianist. And then we also have the Skolgan wedding that is just not too far in the future, less than a month away. And so I think it's kind of apropos that we're going to look at this parable. What I would like to do is read the first 3 verses as we begin to examine this. So Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 through 3. Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come." Now again, this is one of Jesus' parables. And just to remind you that a parable is a simple story that is told in order to illustrate a point. And so in this story, Jesus is trying to make something understandable, and what he's trying to make understandable is the kingdom of heaven. And if you also remember this, the kingdom was the number one topic or subject that Jesus talked about the very most when he was on this earth. That is significant in our lives, and it's important to always remember. So what I would like to do is begin to break down the story by examining verse 1. So let me just read it again. "The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son." So we have a king and we have a son, and the son would be likened in this story unto the Son of God. And in this story, the king would represent God the Father. He's the King of Kings and he's the Lord of Lords. And the king is throwing a wedding feast for his son because he's getting married. And whenever the king throws a wedding feast or has a party, it's going to be the biggest and the best. Nobody throws a bigger celebration than the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. This is applicable to our lives. And you've got to think of it that way. It's a huge celebration, the greatest celebration that you could ever have in the world, ultimately. Now, who is the son marrying? Well, the Bible tells us that he's marrying his betrothed, in essence, the bride that he's been engaged to, but the Bible specifically calls his bride the bride of Christ, and that's you and I. He's marrying us. Now, just to give you a little historical understanding of this parable as it's being told by Jesus, this is from Matthew chapter 22, but in Matthew chapter 27, Jesus goes to the cross and he dies on the cross. This is important to realize because Jesus is about to die on the cross. Here's what he's doing. He's preparing his bride for the wedding. By going to the cross, he's preparing her, that's you and I, for the wedding. What does that mean? You see, his bride has to have on the right gown, on the right wedding dress. In other words, the bride has to put on robes of righteousness or a gown of purity. And so Jesus is going to the cross to make you and I presentable to be married to the Son. Isn't that an amazing thought when you think about it? Now I want you to look at verse 3. Again, it says, he sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. Now, a Jewish wedding back during these times functioned a little bit different than weddings today. Because what would happen is that the couple would get engaged, that's betrothed to each other, but there would be no set date as far as when the wedding was actually going to take place. And so what the couple would do then is they would prepare to get married. That involved a dowry, it involved a place to live, it involved a number of things, but they would go to make preparations in order to become married. So the people were aware of the engagement of the betrothed period of time, but then the wedding, when things were ready, then they would just have the wedding. And people would just come in a short moment's notice. So that gives you a little understanding of how a wedding works. Now, in this story, who would the guests that were invited to the wedding feast represent? Well, they represent, first of all, the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, because that was God's first love, and salvation went to the people that he loved. But then I want you to notice the last part of this verse, verse 3, because it says they refused to come. Now, let me see if I can give you a little understanding of what this really means, but if I can use the Scogan wedding as an example for just a moment. I know that Willow and Jonathan have sent out their invitations, and they've sent out a lot of invitations, and they're already getting a lot of response, right? And it's going to be a very large wedding. But can you imagine just for a moment if they sent out all these invitations and nobody responded and nobody wanted to come? Can you imagine how it would hurt both Willow and Jonathan and hurt their parents? It would cut them to the quick, because here is the greatest celebration. A wedding feast is about to happen. A wedding is about to take place, and everybody refused to come. Nobody wanted to celebrate with them. Can you take that and understand the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, our Heavenly Father, and how he would feel if the invitations went out, the wedding was about to happen, and nobody wanted to come? That's exactly what's taking place here. But what is the king's response to the fact that nobody wants to come? Look at verse 4 now. It says, then he, meaning the king, sent some more servants and said, tell those who have been invited that I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fatted cattle have been butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet. What the king's response to the negative response to the wedding is this: he shows great love, he shows grace, and he shows patience, and he sends out more servants to personally go to each person that's been invited to re-invite them, to invite them again. He wants to make sure that they understand the wedding's going to happen right now. Please come. So there's something else that is important to realize in this story, because the kingdom, in other words, is about to be inaugurated. See, this parable is about the kingdom. That's the central theme of why Jesus is telling it. The kingdom is about to be inaugurated, and the only way for anybody to enter into the kingdom of heaven is by marrying the king's son. It's no different than in the past you would have one kingdom who maybe the king had a son, and over in this kingdom the king had a daughter, and in order to have unity between the kingdoms, the son and the daughter would marry, and they would bring the two kingdoms together. This is what the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords is doing for us. He's offering his son to marry us as his bride so that we can come in relationship with him. Isn't that an amazing thought? That's what we're learning from this parable. So now, what is the response of the people since they've been clearly invited a second time? And the understanding here is that they're not just being invited twice, but they're being invited over and over again repeatedly. Now let's look at verses 5 and 6 in the story. But they, the people, paid no attention and went off, one to his field, another to his business. The rest seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. And so the hearts of the people that were invited became even harder. They not only continued to refuse to come to the wedding, but now they became aggressive against the wedding and against the king and against the son. And what did they do? The servants that the king had sent out to say, come to the wedding, they seized them and they mistreated them, which means that they tortured them or persecuted them to the point that they killed them. That's an amazing thought. Now, in this parable, who would the servants that the king sent out to tell about the wedding, who would they represent? Well, they represent the prophets who God sent to his people, the Jewish people, throughout their history to testify of the coming of the Messiah, the Savior of the world. They were invited and they knew about the wedding for years and years and years because of the prophets and the prophecies that had been in their writings for years. So now what is the response of the king? Because the people actually killed the servants that he sent out. What is his response as they continued to refuse to come to the wedding? Let's go to verse 7. The king was enraged. He sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Now, I want you to keep in mind this verse is from the parable of the wedding feast, Matthew chapter 22. But are you catching what's actually being said here, what we're actually beginning to see? Because the king, and remember the king is God, the King of kings and the Lord of lords, we're learning that he's going to send his army to destroy these people and their city because they refused to come to the wedding feast and marry his son. So what city is being referred to in this verse that's going to be burned? It's the city of Jerusalem. And what army did God send to destroy these people that refused to come? We know from history it was the Roman army. And they came to the city of Jerusalem in AD 70, and they burned the city and they destroyed all the people that were in that city at that time, 1.1 million Jews. And so this parable is recorded, again, in Matthew chapter 22. It's 2 chapters before Matthew chapter 24, which is the key chapter that I've been focusing on as we've been talking about prophecy, because it contains the words of Jesus. And yet, because of the parable, we are gaining a greater understanding concerning what Jesus meant in chapter 24 and what's about to happen in Matthew chapter 24. So let's look once again. If I can take you to Matthew chapter 24, I would like to look at one verse, verse 3. We've looked at this verse in the past, but now we're going to amplify it a little bit more. And I just want to read the second half of verse 3. Again, Matthew chapter 24, verse 3. The disciples in this verse are asking Jesus a question, and here's the question. They said, "Tell us, when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And so the disciples are asking 2 questions, but really it's only one question because the 2 questions relate to each other. They're asking, what will be the sign of your coming, and what will be the sign of the end of the age? Now, it's all going to happen at the same time. These 2 questions are really together. Christ's coming and the end of the age are simultaneous events. This is so important to understand in the context. Now, we already know from the parable of the wedding feast that the king's wrath is about to be poured out on the people who refuse to come and celebrate the son's wedding. It's about to be poured out on the people who refuse to marry the son and to celebrate. So the disciples then are asking Jesus, "Jesus, when are you going to come in judgment, and when is your wrath going to be poured out and bring an end to the Jewish age?" That's what is being asked by the disciples in Matthew chapter 24. Now, are you catching what I just shared with you? the significance of it. Because what I have just pointed out changes our traditional understanding of how we have understood both verse 3 and much of Matthew chapter 24. Because the disciples are not asking about a second coming, as we have labeled it, and they're not asking about a final coming when God comes in his glory. That's not the context. The disciples want to know what will be the signs leading up to Jesus coming in judgment against the Jewish people. And why is he coming in judgment? Because they refused the invitation to the wedding. They refused to believe in the Messiah. They refused to believe in the Son. Now, just in case this is not understandable, I would like to take you to Matthew chapter 23 now. Chapter 23 is right before 24. We've been looking at the parable of the wedding feast in Matthew chapter 22. But in Matthew chapter 23, and I'm going to read the first 2 verses of this chapter, here's what it says. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Now notice in this verse, we learned this already from just these first 2 verses. Jesus is speaking both to the disciples and he's speaking to the crowds of people. The word that is actually used here is multitudes of people. And the understanding of the term multitude means there were so many you couldn't count them. So Jesus is most likely speaking to thousands of people that have gathered to listen to him. And the very first thing that he says to the people is that the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. That means that they are teaching the law, the old covenant, the rules and the regulations. And the fact that they are seated in the seat of Moses, because remember, Moses is the one that received the 10 Commandments, which is the law. The fact that they're seated in the seat of Moses means that they refuse to see anything else, meaning they can't see the Son. They can't see what Jesus is about to do on the cross. Now, I'm not going to read the rest of the chapter, verses 3 and on, but if you read that sometime, Jesus warns the people about the Pharisees and the religious leaders. But I want to jump down now to verse 13, because this is where Jesus gives very strong language about the religious leaders, the Jewish leaders, and about what's to happen to the nation of Israel. And if you have a heading within your Bible, it's called the 7 woes. Let me give you an example by reading verse 13. Again, Jesus is talking to the multitude still. He's talking to the disciples. And he says, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the kingdom of heaven in men's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. Now, the context of the parable in Matthew chapter 22 is Jesus is telling this parable to illustrate the kingdom, to give understanding of the kingdom. In Matthew chapter 23, he starts giving 7 woes. This is the first woe. And he says that the Pharisees, the religious leaders, they shut up the kingdom when it comes to other people. In other words, rather than communicating the wonder of the kingdom to people, they're hiding the kingdom from people, and they themselves are refusing to believe in the kingdom. The very opposite of the parable of the wedding feast, where Jesus wants everybody to be invited and come and marry the Son, to marry himself in this. Then he goes in to the rest of the woes, which I'm not going to look at, but the word woe means this: deep suffering, grief, trouble. And so what Jesus is saying is that deep suffering and tribulation is about to come on to the religious leaders and to the nation of Israel. Again, why would it come? Because they have refused to come to the wedding feast. They refused to be married to the Son. They've declined the invitation, and they have persecuted and killed the prophets or the servants that the king sent out to say, come to the wedding, it's ready. And the word woe in the Bible is interesting because it's always used in conjunction with a king. And what that means is that these woes, or this woe, is coming from the king. It's coming from God himself as he's pronouncing judgment. Now I want to take you to the end of Matthew chapter 23 because Jesus begins to draw a conclusion in terms of what he's saying about the religious leaders as he's speaking to the multitudes of people. So I want to take you to verse 33, and I'm going to read verses 33 through 36. This is strong language. Just listen. Jesus says, "You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Therefore I am sending you prophets and wise men and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zacharias, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. I tell you the truth, all this will come upon this generation." Notice the language. Jesus is calling the religious leaders snakes and vipers, and he's saying judgment is coming. And then he says, though, and this is an act of love, "I'm going to send my prophets, my wise men, and my teachers to you." Why is he sending them? In spite of their rebellious heart, he wants them to come to the wedding feast. He wants them to believe in the Messiah. He wants to see them saved. Jesus wants to come in relationship to them. So he sends them, but what do? They crucify and kill them. They torture and kill his witnesses, his servants, as they're sent. The very thing that we saw back in the parable. And the result of this is that all the innocent blood of the righteous is going to fall upon the Jewish people because of their disbelief. And then we also learn, when is this going to happen? It's going to happen again within a generation of time, which is 40 years. Jesus is saying there's going to be coming right now a 40-year period of time, and all these things are going to happen. So when you begin to understand Matthew chapter 23, or 22 and 23, are you beginning to see how there's a framework to understand Matthew chapter 24, the prophecy of Jesus that we've been looking at? And so in Matthew chapter 24, verse 3, the disciples are asking Jesus a question: what's going to be the sign of your coming in judgment? What is going to be the sign of you coming in judgment against the nation of Israel, where the Jewish system of the law, the Jewish religious system, also is going to end? And so let me just share with you a little bit of Matthew chapter 24 now, where Jesus says, here's the signs. And I want to start with verse 4. And here's what Jesus told his disciples. Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many." Historically, we already know this, that during this 40-year period of time, there were many false Christs that came onto the scene. Many false Christs, more than any other time in history, including our present age. There are some false Christs around today. There have been false Christs over the last couple hundred years, but during this time, there were many false Christs that came on the scene. Now look at verse 6. "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed." Now, do you notice who Jesus is talking to? In Matthew 24, he's talking to his disciples. He's answering their question. So he's talking to them, and in essence, the early church. He says, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. He's not talking to us. He was talking to his disciples in the early church to warn them exactly what was going to happen. Such things must happen, but the end is still not to come. Verse 7, Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these things are the beginning of birth pains. And I had already made a comment in the past concerning birth pains, because whenever a woman is about to have a baby, there's pain. But it's that pain precedes something wonderful. And so even though the early church, because of the persecution coming to the Jews, the early church is going to suffer too. They're not going to go through the persecution that God is bringing to the Jews, but there's going to be persecution against them because of the Jews. But Jesus is saying it's the beginning of some wonderful things, because salvation is coming. Jesus is about to die on the cross, and this life is going to be birthed, the life of salvation. Verse 9, then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. Again, it's not talking to us today, 2,000 years later. This is talking to the early church, and they went through a lot of persecution during this time, but they were faithful. Verse 10, at that time many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of many or most will grow cold, but he who stands firm to the end will be saved. When it says he who stands firm to the end will be saved, it's not talking about being saved from our sin. It's talking about Christians being saved from the tribulation that's coming to the Jews. Because later in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation, flee to the hills. And that's exactly what the Christians did. They fled to the hills. Everybody else, the Jewish people, went to Jerusalem. They went into the city because they thought that would keep them safe. And the Roman army came and surrounded the city. They starved out the people that were living in the city. There was cannibalism. There was murders that were taking place within the city, terrible atrocities. But all the Christians listened to the words of Jesus, and they fled to the hills, to the mountains, and they were safe. That's the salvation that's being talked about here. It's not being saved from our sin. Verse 13, I'll just repeat. But he who stands firm to the end will be saved, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. The end of what? Not the end of the world, but the end of the Jewish system. Jerusalem was burned. The people in it, because of their rebellion and disobedience, were killed. But the result is that the gospel had a freedom to go forward like never before. The Jewish system was persecuting Christianity, and Jesus dealt with it so that the gospel could go forward. Isn't it interesting that the very people who had the testimony of the prophets incorporated in all over their history are the same people that killed the prophets and refused to believe in the Messiah? That generation. Isn't it interesting that the very people who really understood the parable of the wedding feast, they understood it much greater than you and I have. They understood the time and everything, but they're the same people who refused to come to the wedding feast. Now, I want to take you back to Matthew chapter 22, and we'll conclude this parable, okay? So verse 8, beginning with verse 8 of Matthew 22. Then he, again, this is Jesus, but it's the king. Then he said to his servants, the wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. Go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you find. So the servants went out into the streets and gathered all the people they could find, both good and bad, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. This is good news for us. The Jewish people at that time refused the invitation of the king to come and marry his son. So what did the king do now? He sent out his servants one more time to the highways, into the byways, and he invited whoever would be willing to come. The tax collectors, the prostitutes, the drug addicts, the down and outers, and guess what? Also you and I. And the invitation is continuing to go out today. Jesus has died on the cross. People can step into a relationship with the King through Jesus, his Son, because of what he did for us on the cross. And you and I are to continue taking this message to other people. But isn't it fun to see the proper context of these parables? Because it puts it in a place where we can understand it. And then as we've been wrestling with the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 24, we can begin to understand those words in light of the proper way that they were meant for us to understand. I'm going to ask Wyatt and Caius to come up, and we're going to close with a song, and then I'll close the service after that.